In our study of the Life Divine, we are reading the chapter titled Man and the Evolution. As a first step in this chapter, Sri Aurobindo described the process by which consciousness emerges out of matter, out of inconscience, and the struggle of that passage, the fact that at each step matter is literally dragging back the emerging consciousness, and in spite of that resistance, somehow we see the emergence of life and mind. Yet out of this, he says, mental man has still to evolve out of himself the fully conscious being, a divine manhood, or a spiritual and supramental supermanhood, which shall be the next product of the evolution. This is the picture we have before us of the work which is yet to be done in evolution. The difference is, all of the earlier evolution was done unconscious to us. We were not conscious participants. It was the struggle of nature or some power of nature pushing, compelling. But we are at a point of transition where we are conscious enough that we can participate and therefore actively accelerate the process. This evolutionary process itself, he describes as two layers or two different movements, double process. There is an outward visible physical evolution with birth as its machinery. With every birth in the species, there is a increase, growth of capacities, powers of consciousness. Primarily, the body form is kept by the heredity, and separate from this is an invisible inner process of the soul evolving through rebirth, taking steps through grades of form and consciousness, using the machinery of form to grow in consciousness. Now, these two he is going to describe, and then he is going to question the whole evolutionary process itself. Is it at all necessary? With the evidence that we have of all the things we have already accepted, can we not explain all this without the need for an evolution? And this discussion will go through several pages. The reason for the discussion is, as you will see, the logic of it is very compelling. And it, in fact, represents a certain truth which we have to accept. And that truth is primarily in the external form. That's why he has made this description of a double evolution, where in the external form, you realize that the individual is not so important. It is the race as a whole which evolves, or clusters, subgroups within the race which evolve into specialized capacities and then again mingle to mix to create more diverse capacities. And the individual does not have much of a role. The role of the individual, if it had to come back, it would necessitate rebirth as a mechanism. Otherwise, one lifetime is too short to be able to make enough growth for the individual. By separating these two, he allows for a discussion now of the surface part of the evolutionary process, and then the inner part, which will be the individual consciousness, the soul evolving. And we will see how the two will rejoin, but still it will be the inner using the mechanism of the outer. And in the next chapter, which is titled The Evolution of the Spiritual Man, there will be the greater emphasis on this inner evolution. But to understand the mechanism of the outer and the deeper principles of evolution, this discussion will be essential, because it is on the basis of this that we will be able to formulate how the supramental evolution will take place. Because certain fundamental processes and principles will still remain. Even if they change certain aspects, they will still be there as principles. So, we see that there are grades of cosmic manifestation, types of forms which can house the spirit, and the individual soul, in its through passage of rebirth, uses different types, allowing it to express higher grades of consciousness. As an example, a dog which has sufficiently evolved, and many of us have this experience, that it is almost as if it could speak, it would be as much as a human being. But it cannot. This consciousness individualized in the dog, if it were now to take birth in a human body, you will have a fully functional human being with the full possibility of intelligence being able to express. The dog consciousness or the dog vehicle prevented consciousness from expressing itself beyond a point. But there is already another vehicle of that grade available in the human body, and the soul need only change into the new vehicle, and now it can express fully its power of current development and continue therefore its further development. And so it can keep moving across forms, each time expressing its greater power. But the evolution is taking place primarily in the consciousness which is inhabiting, not in the form itself. And now Sri Aurobindo brings us this question. Is there at all evolution in the form? Do we even need to have this to explain what we are seeing? Is it even necessary in the cosmos for form to be able to evolve? He says we can challenge the theory of evolution that by saying that it is not sufficiently founded and it is even unnecessary as an explanation for the earthly existence. And we can question whether, even if you accept evolution, can human being evolve now further into a supramental type? Maybe this is the peak. Maybe the whole point is to have an evolution possible up to the level of mind, not further ranges which belong to a higher domain, and they are just there on other levels of consciousness but not available to the material physical experience. Maybe. And these questions he raises because they are legitimate questions. In fact, as we will see as we go along the logic of this, many of the things which are declared, in fact, have been declared by many philosophies and traditions. Some of them even saying, well, there is no such evolution possible. Mind is the maximum. And so by raising all these questions, Sri Aurobindo answers them by going to the core principles within evolution, and then we understand why it is so and how it would represent in a further stage. So this is going to be extremely important, although it is a bit argumentative, but it will help us to understand through the argumentation. So we will, as we go through these few pages, in parts we will summarize, in parts we will elaborate on the words where he throws in important critical insights. So, another construction, neither teleological nor evolutionary, can be put on the workings of the spirit in the manifestation here. And it may be as well, before proceeding farther, to formulate succinctly the line of thinking which makes such a construction possible. So he is going to summarize this whole, but the summary will take several pages. Where there is neither evolution, meaning forms in a continuous process of change, nor the sense of a purpose, what he uses the word teleological, the sense of a purpose, the sense of a perfection, the sense of something towards which everything has to move, that also need not be there. And yet we can explain all that we have seen. And we still retain all the key principles so far developed in earlier chapters of the Life Divine, admitting that creation is a manifestation of the timeless eternal in a time eternity. So behind is a consciousness which is timeless, eternal. It pours itself out in an experience of time and space. This we accept. Admitting there are 7 grades of consciousness, which also has been dealt with such clarity of logic in earlier chapters that we cannot question. And the 7 grades of the 3 lower are physical, the vital or pranic, mental. In between, bridging the lower half and the upper half is the supramental, which knows the oneness of the upper and the multiplicity of the lower. And then in the upper, the Ananda, Chit and Sat. So 3 above, 3 below, as if in a reflection. The supermind in between, bridging the oneness and the multiplicity below. And you have 7 principles without which there could not be cosmos. And all this has been discussed before. So we admit there are 7 grades of consciousness. We admit also that material inconscience has been laid as a base for the reascent of the spirit, admitting even a rebirth as a fact. Still, a spiritual evolution of the individual being is not an inevitable consequence of any of these admissions. We can conceive of a world where you do not have a spiritual evolution of the individual. Yes, there can be a collective evolution. There can be consciousness that is, so to say, represented in so many levels. It is possible to take another view of the spiritual significance and inner process of terrestrial existence. If each thing created is a form of the manifest divine existence, each is divine in itself by the spiritual presence within it, whatever its appearance, its figure or character in nature. In each form of manifestation, the divine takes the delight of existence. And there is no need of change or progress within it. So here is a description he places. The divine plays in each. In each there is the presence. In each the presence enjoys and experiences the delight. Do you need progress? Isn't the divine fulfilled in playing out all of these levels which are possible through many of the different forms, and perhaps other forms may appear, some may fade out. But the divine is having a complete experience of all the levels of creation. Whatever ordered display or hierarchy of actualized possibilities is necessitated by the nature of the infinite being. Necessitated, meaning you have to have a hierarchy, you have to have an order, because that is the nature of the infinite. And so if the infinite manifests, it has to manifest in an order, in a hierarchy, in a meaningful framework, not chaotic. Whatever necessity is there, he says, is sufficiently provided for by the numberless variations, the teeming multitude of forms, types of consciousness, natures that we see around us. So he has described here 3 things. In all the variations which you see, there are 3 things. The multitude of forms. You have the horse, you have the giraffe, you have the penguin, all kinds of variations. Anything you could think of Try to think of the most crazy form, and you'll find something in nature which is close enough approximation of it. It's very difficult to try to conceive of a form which is not already somehow captured by nature. You might still make up some, but then if you dig deep enough, you will find somewhere in the past that form existed, and now it has become extinct. But nature has played with it. So you have this multitude of forms. Within that, there are types of consciousness. There's a consciousness, for example, which is expressive of force. There's a consciousness which is expressive of fine skill. There's a consciousness which is expressive of freedom. There's a consciousness which is expressive of security and binding in limitation, moving slowly, gradually. Any kind of consciousness you can conceive of, there is a form which somehow represents it. And third, natures, types of nature that we see. And here it becomes more in the character of the form itself. In their behavior, we find very distinctive variations. The bird has a behavior, its nature is to be like this, and very different from the snake, whose nature is to be like that. And if you think in these terms, every type of nature even exists. Within a form, sometimes there are variations of nature. The most obvious is, of course, in the human being, where the overall type does not have too much variation at a genetic level, but psychological variations are immense. Genetically, if you take the most divergent human racial subtypes, the actual variation of genes within that will be something like 0.1 or less percent. But the psychological variations are immense. Now, all of this makes for sufficiently rich vehicles to express the full spectrum of possibilities of the divine infinite being. Then, there is no teleological purpose in creation, and there cannot be, for all is there in the infinite. You do not need a purpose. Now we have to get to some perfection, some realization, some higher ultimate thing. It's all there already. The divine has nothing that he needs to gain or that he has not. If there is creation and manifestation, it is for the delight of creation, of manifestation, not for any purpose, no goal that you have to grow through or achieve. There is then no reason for an evolutionary movement with a culmination to be reached or an aim to be worked out and effectuated, or a drive towards ultimate perfection. Now here he puts three broad impulses. First, he describes culmination to be reached. You will find somehow innate to our human thinking, to the way our mind is formed, we have the sense that we have to get to something, and reaching there we will be happy, we will be complete, we will have achieved and we can rest. That sense is somehow latent in the very way our mind is formed. If nothing else, it takes a more practical form. In my life, I have to reach some status in my career, some level of achievement of my capacity. I have a potential, I must fully develop it, and there's a point where I will reach fully developed. I can say, now it is done, I can rest in my full development. So there is somewhere this idea of something to be reached. But in this picture which he is placing before us, you have no thing to reach. Even in the spiritual evolutionary concept, we speak of this supermind, superman, some state of consciousness or a new expression in form of that consciousness which should be reached. If you had come upon earth, let's say a few billion years ago, before the human type has emerged, you could have looked at the current then status of consciousness and species inhabiting the consciousness and said, well, this is enough. Why do you want something else? This is complete enough. So the same way we can look at the human place and maybe some higher, finer types of humanity, including the sage and the occasional odd spiritual, more awakened, mystical human being and say, well, that still covers the spectrum. You don't need a thing to reach, culmination to be reached, or aim to be worked out. Now, this is more subtle. The sense of making society perfect. We have an aim that we need to work out to make everybody happy. We feel somehow the need. It's not acceptable if some people are happy and other people have to suffer so that these people may be happy. Can we not organize society so that everybody can be happy? Everybody can be fulfilled in whatever their unique way? And so there is somehow the sense of an aim that we need to work out, which will be a culmination in what we are here for. An aim to be worked out or effectuated, brought out. We have worked it out in our consciousness. Okay, we are all one spiritual family, but can we organize that truth in our practical living? Or a drive towards ultimate perfection. This becomes even more abstract. We have within us the drive that there is some sense of perfection we can reach, but which is ultimate, which is beyond even the concept of my mind. And none of this becomes necessary in this frame that He has placed before us. But the sense of an ultimate perfection exceeds even our own imagination. The moment our mind conceives of a perfection, and we can conceive many kinds of perfection, we can say, but there is still something missing, it needs to go further. And we conceive of something more, it can go further. So the sense of an ultimate is always there behind. Now all of these three impulses which he has described are there within us because there is that deeper truth of our soul, of our spirit. Because we are already that somewhere, and therefore these impulses take this form. But if you look at the existing status of things, the way he has described it, that and this do not match. The gap is so great that we can look at the existing status and say, yes, but that is only a fantasy that you have. Maybe you have the urge, maybe you have the drive, but it's not practical. Look at the reality, and there's a gap. In fact, we see that the principles of creation are permanent and unchanging. Each type of being remains itself and does not try nor has any need to become other than itself. So now he is going to justify all this removal of all this higher drive of some ultimate perfection or aim or goal to be reached. He is going to justify, logically place the arguments for no need for evolution. Look at the reality. Every type is unchanging, remains what it is, doesn't feel the need to become other than itself, except perhaps the human being, by the way. But even that, in a few human beings who are a little off, they are not normal anyway. But if you look at a horse is not trying to become a zebra or a giraffe or an elephant. It is happy to be horse. A lion does not try to become horse or a rabbit. Each is fitted within the type, and within its type it plays at variations. So lion tries to be more lion. Horse tries to be more horse. So it remains itself, does not try or has any need to become other than. But the human being, at least a few of the crazy ones, they say, yes, but I'm so dissatisfied with this, there has to be something more, otherwise life has no meaning. And I want to be able to be that something more, and we feel that it's possible and within our reach. Still, we may tend to view that something more as only an exaggeration of the human capacity. Greater intelligence, greater power, greater love, greater harmony, greater skill, whatever form. Granting that some types of existence disappear and others come into being, it is because the consciousness force in the universe withdraws its life delight from that from those that perish and turns to create others for its pleasure. So we have seen that some forms have vanished, others have emerged. In fact, there's a very interesting pattern. Approximately every 60 million years, there is a massive extinction in which more than 80% of types of species vanish, and then again a new efflorescence of new types, species, both of plants and of animals. Every about 60 million years. The fossil evidence is clear enough. There is a sub-cycle of about 30 million years also, but not as sharp. We are already at one of those transition points, because the last was 60 million years ago when the dinosaur became extinct. And we are now seeing a massive extinction taking place where about 3% of species is becoming extinct. 2.5% of species is becoming extinct every year or two. And at this rate, within about 100 years, all the species will be extinct. Of course, before that, the life systems will collapse. And we are currently in an era of extinction. Just as there is this collapse, there could be something which also triggers a new efflorescence, but we don't know the mechanism for that. But why does this happen? And Sri Aurobindo gives you the insight here. The consciousness force in the universe withdraws its life delight from those that perish. So consciousness force, C and F capital, meaning the consciousness working as force, the divine creative force which is conscious of what it is doing and how it's working. It has a delight of playing in that form, to be dinosaur, to play out the game of dinosaur relationships. That was fun. Delight. And when it has fulfilled that, it says, enough of this. Now let's play a different kind of form, a different game. So as it withdraws, somehow that species begins to lose energy, enthusiasm. The force that sustains it begins to deplete until it becomes extinct. Now, in human mental terms, we still need an external event. Some comet must have fallen, some earthquake, some change of climate which would have caused an extinction. But if you look more deeply, those are only external triggers which make for the sudden change. If the delight of the divine enjoying in that form was still present, it would say, wow, here's a challenging situation, and it would assert its delight to somehow survive and move around and survive, adapt to the new circumstances. When that energy of its delight has withdrawn and there is a sudden shift, it does not have in it the push to be able to adapt and survive, and so it collapses. So still, the external cause of collapse is only a trigger. Well before that, the withdrawal had begun. Now, if you look at this in terms of human beings today, you will see this happening quite actively. Certain types of activity for the human mind, for the human body, which were cause of great delight for a particular period of a civilization's development, suddenly loses force, becomes uninteresting, and something else begins to take its place. If you look at the turn, particularly recently, of people, young children, taking great joy in playing with electronic devices. You cannot explain how a 2-year-old child is able to take a mobile phone or a tablet and learn to play with it in a very short time, more skillfully than the adult grandparent. You cannot explain it unless you recognize that the consciousness force in the children wants now to play with this. And it has already begun to withdraw from other things which were interesting in an earlier phase. And those things now are no more interesting for these children. One of the changes you see is in the mind of the younger, let's say teenagers, refusal to enter in depth which commits you for many years of struggle. refusal to enter into mastery in depth. Instead, the impulse is to broaden, widen, universalize mind. So many of the arts are dying out because they demanded a commitment going for 10 or 20 years. Or some of the martial arts which demonstrate such an extraordinary perfection of the human body or capacity. Some of the artistic lines of music or painting which demand so much commitment to build to that level of mastery. You have less and less people joining. Why? Because the urge of the consciousness force is to widening and universalizing, not specializing in a narrow way. Maybe it will change, but right now this is the case. And as a result, so much is being lost. Another urge which we have touched upon in other discussions here is the loss of interest in an ascetic withdrawal. Where earlier, go back barely a few hundred years ago, and everywhere on earth you had people joyously withdrawing from life to dedicate themselves to an ascetic concentration, religious or other form of pursuit, but ascetic withdrawal from life. And happily. Today if you tell somebody, no, you will have to withdraw and live in a cloister, I'm not going to do that, I want to enjoy life. And the result of it is everywhere, in all traditions, nobody is joining the order of monks. I was recently in Sarnath, where we went to a monastery, and they said it is a huge crisis. All of the old monasteries, of the Buddhist monasteries, have one or two monks which are somehow still keeping it going. None of the younger people want to get into it. They're happy to learn, they're happy to study, but to take up the life of a monk is just not happening. Similarly, I have seen in other Vedantic traditions, where earlier they would have 100 monks wanting to join every year, now it's dropped to 4. And even that may or may not last too long. And the lady who was explaining this to us, she said, there are a few of the older generation who are so fixated on preserving their tradition that they will somehow just ignore the fact that nobody is joining them, keep on going, persisting until they die, and they'll say, we did our part and the rest doesn't matter. But you can literally see a dying breed of that mindset. So it's not just in physical forms of life that this change takes place, but even in the psychological types and specializations in humanity that this change takes place. So here is a very important principle Sri Aurobindo is showing us in evolution. The prime driver of evolution, of experience as well as of form, is this delight of the conscious force. Sat Chit Ananda, existence which is consciousness and force of consciousness expressing its delight. That is the driver behind secretly. So the existence is supporting, and it activates itself through the consciousness and the force of consciousness delighting in activity. The moment it chooses now, okay, this is not so interesting, the delight withdraws, the force withdraws, the consciousness withdraws, and the existence is no more manifest in this form. But the same existence may turn in consciousness to now a different form, a different delight, a different variation, and increase that. So when you see the dinosaur becoming extinct, it is because a decision was already taken to withdraw. The rest is only external means of how it happened, faster or slower, it would still have happened. We see, for example, today, certain species, they have no reason to die out, but they're just dying out because the force behind is withdrawing. At the same time, the force says, but I want to experience this. And immediately an efflorescence of types and variations around that type bursts out. In the form of plants and flowers, you will see this happening, and it's already moving in a certain direction. Where possible, it may use the human mind to speed up the process. Through the human mind saying, can I make a flower that is blue or green, or a rose that is violet? And you tweak the genes. But what made the human mind take delight in this? The consciousness force working within the human being, using it as an instrument to accelerate other changes, which otherwise it would have had to do through a slower process. But at the same time, we do not think of other possibilities which we could also tweak with genes. Somehow they're not so interesting. So we have to look at the deeper cause behind. What is it going to do? And so if you really want to know what's going to happen next in evolution, you cannot explain it by purely external means. You can only explain or predict by recognizing the choice that is made by the consciousness force in its play of delight. Sri Aurobindo, in his writings on the ideal of human unity, he points to certain inflection transitions of history. There are transitions for which there is a clear cause. This happened and so the rest happened. And then there are transitions where there is no cause. Suddenly something emerges for no reason at all. And he says those are the ones which are most important. And unless you can explain those, you have not got to the true principle of social development or human unity. And this is the insight we have. There is a consciousness behind that chooses enough of this play, now I have to move to that. And whoop, in a single generation, there's a radical turn of interest, focus, and an age is passed, a new age begun, and it's done. You will recall one of the messages that the mother gave, where she says words to this effect, that now once again nature is feeling in her this urge to take a great leap. And this is a very interesting description, because the future of humanity is dependent on the urge that nature feels in herself. And once she feels the urge and she begins to move to it, human beings and human events will follow. And you do not need external causes. And that's what we are seeing today in a great leap of evolution. Effectively, it takes the form that people suddenly begin to conceive of what if. Suddenly they feel the urge to a little more, a little better, or enough of this little more, little better. I need a big change, a great leap. And that just comes up. So here is the key. Because the consciousness force in the universe withdraws its life delight from those that perish and turns to create others for its pleasure. Now, in that transition which took place 60 million years ago, we see something extraordinary. There were big ones and small ones for every species. The big ones vanished, only the small ones remained. Practically every type had a giant version and a smaller version. The few that remain are in the ocean, where you have the whale as well as the dolphin. But in the mammals, the big ones became extinct, the small ones stayed. It's as if nature had experimented with size, and now she said, enough of size, now let me focus on skill, rapidity, and so on. But she leaves a few examples. The elephant is still there, but you see numbers, very few. The mammoth is extinct. The same with plants. The giant plants which you have, well, human beings have cut them out, but still, what you have today are all midgets. And even the human intervention in plant is to make midget coconut trees, midget mango trees. Everything is growing towards smaller size. But each type of life, while it lasts, has its own pattern and remains faithful with whatever minor variations to that pattern. So the dolphin stayed dolphin and the whale stayed whale. I wanted to point to this other factor. There were also giant humans. There were really large human beings also which had developed, which, like the dinosaur, became extinct. And the evidence for that still survives. We do find occasionally these very large bones, and it is covered up for certain political and religious reasons. Many of these have survived even in human cultures. In South America, the evidence is still present of the Europeans, priests and missionaries who first went there, documenting bones of giants, including mummified bodies of giants. And these were Jesuit priests. In great detail, they sent back reports which are still available, barely 300 years ago, where one of the priests says he took his sword and inserted it in the mummified body of a giant. The eyeball was so big that the entire sword went into it. So an eyeball about this size. You can imagine the size of the head and the size of the body. Every culture in the world has stories of giants. And somehow many of them have stories also of giants being slain. In Indian subcontinent, we have Rama traveling all through the subcontinent, destroying the demonic beings, but also their types. And many of them are described as being very large. Some of them being so large that they could eat an entire cartload of food in a single meal. So you have to imagine how big that would be. But all of them were eliminated. And somehow it created the space for the emergence of the smaller, more nimble, more agile types. But while it lasts, each type, the giant enjoyed being giant, the midget enjoyed being midget. Within itself, it stays faithful with minor variation. It is bound to its own consciousness and cannot get away from it into other consciousness. Limited by its own nature, it cannot transgress these boundaries and pass into other nature. Now this point is important, and we will see this will become a principle. At every step of consciousness, there are specialized types, but they stay stuck within the type with minor variations of that type. If the consciousness force of the infinite has manifested life after manifesting matter, and mind after manifesting life, it does not follow that it will proceed to manifest supermind as the next terrestrial creation. So if everything is bound within its own type, the human being also is bound within its own type, even if the variations are larger or there are many subtypes. What is to say that there is going to be a supermind as next terrestrial creation? Maybe in some spiritual world, not in the physical. For mind and supermind belong to quite different hemispheres. Mind to the lower status of the ignorance, supermind to the higher status of the divine knowledge. So the difference is so radical, you cannot explain it and say this has to happen. Now all of this you will see is going contrary to Sri Aurobindo's own earlier assertions. But he's placing this before us because logically this stands and for the evidence given. This world is a world of the ignorance and intended to be that way. If you accept that every species stays within its type, well, the ignorant mind has to stay within ignorant mind with more or less variation. And if there is to be a divine knowledge, well, it will have to be something out there, not as an evolutionary emergence from this. So, there need be no intention to bring down the powers of the higher hemisphere into the lower half of existence, or to manifest their concealed presence there. Now here the two things which should have made for a supramental evolution would be a higher power wanting to enter and shape matter to make it a fit vehicle for it. This would be one cause. And the other cause would be the principle of the supermind which is hidden inside matter now pushing forward and emerging and reshaping matter. So in the very process of showing you the justification for non-evolution, he is revealing to you what would be the mechanism of evolution. So it need not have done, but this is how it would be if it decided to do it. So let's understand what that is. In our mind, as we are thinking rationally. But the power of reason, you will notice if you observe carefully, the power of reason rests on something which is not reason. A problem is given to you Can you find me a solution for this situation? Your mind starts exploring. When it is exploring, it starts in a particular direction which it feels to be right or closer to the solution. It does not start by trying out every possibility, isn't it? If you do a Google search for a word, the computer engine at the back end has to search through every possible web page. And then it finds a match here, places that before you. But when you say, find a solution for this problem, you don't start by every possibility. You straight away narrow down to something which is more likely. What in your mind knows this is more likely? What in your mind was aware of all the possibilities and immediately was able to go, these are the most likely ones. If it knows these are the most likely ones, it knows the others are not likely ones. In other words, it is aware of the whole and instantly can pick the direction, at least broadly. This power of all awareness and instant insight is the supramental consciousness, or at least in its lower working as the intuitive consciousness. Next, as you work to solve the problem, someone says, hey, we have a deadline, we have to do this within the next 2 hours or 2 days. I'm very close, I just need another hour or so to solve it. How do you know? You don't know the solution, and yet you feel you're close to it. You can even estimate how much time you would take to do it. So something inside you actually knows your solution as well as how far you are from it and the time it will need in your path to reach it. And that's not your intellect. That's the underlying power of supermind supporting, which already knows the solution and the path to it. When finally you get the solution, you say, now I've got it. How do you know you got it? How do you know there is not another solution? How do you know your solution is complete? The recognition that this is a solution which is valid comes from some part which knows what is the solution already. That's when you know you have reached it. So in all processes of the intellect, there is an underlying secret working of complete knowledge of supermind. If it was not there, your faculty of reason would not function. Now, if you look at a computer, when it has found a solution, it does not know it has found it. It has to match the solution with the terms by which it would recognize a solution. It has to keep going back and forth. Does it match? Does it match? This matches because it's identical. Are there more? I don't know. I have to keep looking. So that's not how your mind is working. And if there is this secret supermind supporting the functioning of reason, then at some point the secret supermind can start nudging the reasoning power and start asserting itself directly. As I turn to find a solution, the secret supermind can push the mind and say, here it is. And when it does that, I call it intuition. If more and more it starts asserting itself, it comes forward, it begins to fill mind and transform from within and replace mind by bringing its light, its power of consciousness, of direct knowledge. And there you have a supramentalized mind. So it's either from the secret hidden supermind supporting emerging, or from above a revealed power of the higher consciousness pushing its way into the mind, bringing its light and rapidly lifting its functioning into its own terms until it replaces completely by its direct functioning. And my mind has been lifted up into supramental awareness. So these are the two mechanisms of transformation, exactly the same processes which were present in the transition from matter to life and life to mind. There was a hidden mind behind life process. There was mind above life process, either a push from above or a pull from above, and then an emergence from within, assisting a transmutation from within, and the two eventually joining, which make for the emergence of the new consciousness. But in this picture, there is no need for any of these, he says. For if they are at all existent here, it is an occult, incommunicable immanence, and only to maintain the creation, not to perfect it. So maybe the whole goal of this creation is for the supermind to remain always behind, supporting, to maintain it. but it doesn't need to come out. And we can accept that also as a possibility. Man is the summit of this ignorant creation. He has reached the utmost consciousness and knowledge of which it is capable. If he tries to go farther, it will only revolve in larger cycles of his own mentality. So what is the possibility if we accept that a type has to remain within its own boundaries of nature? Mind can still grow. But growing farther means you have larger circles, a wider realm of minds working. Increasingly, you will have people who are prodigies, geniuses, who have mastered many fields of knowledge, are able to express many different powers of consciousness, only wider, but not fundamentally shifting out of ignorance into divine knowledge. For that is the curve of his existence here. A finite circling which carries the mind in its revolutions and returns always to the point from which it started. There are traditions even today existent which speak of the whole of evolution as being nothing but a cyclic repetition. Time itself is as if circular. We grow to become purer in consciousness, but we come back and go through the same cycle again and again. All the souls gather, and all the souls again move out and again gather, and all we do is through it all become purer as human beings. That's all. Mind cannot go outside its own cycle. All idea of a straight line of movement, or the progress reaching infinitely upward or sideways into the infinite, is a delusion. One could say this. Because there is nothing out there to tell us that this has to happen. If the soul of man is to go beyond humanity, to reach either a supramental or a still higher status, it must pass out of this cosmic existence either to a plane or a world of bliss and knowledge, or into the unmanifest, eternal and infinite. So some higher plane, or in some withdrawal, and that's all. It is true that science now affirms an evolutionary terrestrial existence. But if the facts with which science deals are reliable, the generalizations it hazards are short-lived. So, while science says there's evolution, look at the facts. And then science has made generalizations. If you question them, they don't last. They don't survive scrutiny. So he explains how it builds up theories for a few centuries, drops them, makes other theories and drops them. And if this is true of physical science, it is even more true of psychological science. And there you have many schools of psychology often contradicting each other. And so there's far greater instability, he says. It passes from one theory to another and conflicting theories. No firm metaphysical building can be erected upon these shifting quicksands. Heredity, upon which science builds its concept of life evolution, is certainly a power, a machinery, for keeping a type of species in unchanged being. The demonstration that it is also an instrument for persistent and progressive variation is very questionable. So he says even the science, the way we look at heredity is, here's a machinery, and that's how the type is retained. But to say that by heredity the type changes, that is questionable. In fact, there is no evidence for it. The heredity variations may allow for variations of the type, but there's nothing in it which allows for a radical shift in one go. It is a conservative tendency, heredity, not evolutionary, he says. All the facts show that a type can vary within its own specification of nature, but there is nothing to show that it can go beyond it. And this is all physical science. It has not yet been really established that ape kind developed into man. Now this is a fact Sri Aurobindo states 100 years ago. In the last 100 years, there has been no improvement in this reality. We have still not found evidence that ape kind developed into man. What we have found is interesting, he says. For it would rather seem that a type resembling the ape, but always characteristic of itself and not of apehood, developed within its own tendencies of nature and became what we know as man, the present human being. So the evidence is like this. There was a certain type. It developed within its type to what we have as the human. But it was never ape. It was already of a different type. And we find today evidence of many other types even within the human. But they all grew within their type, became extinct, but they didn't become the human. You have the Cro-Magnon, and there is the Neanderthal, and there's another one recently found. They gave to it another name. They coexisted, interestingly. The archaeological evidence is that Neanderthal and the Homo sapiens, often found in the same boundary, they seem to be almost friends. Imagine what that would mean. We have the human type, and then we have a subhuman type, but not ape again. And they would be together. And we have stories of this kind. If you go back to the Ramayana, which is dated now to be about 5000 BC, let's say about 7000 years ago, we have the type of what is described as Vanara, which is ape-like, but it's able to walk on 2 feet, it is able to converse. It is quite close to Neanderthal or Cro-Magnon, but they were together with human beings. They had their own kings and kingdoms. They could mate with human beings. So kind of a 2 strata of different species altogether. One of them faded out, of course. It is not even established that inferior races of man developed out of themselves the superior races. Now, if you say there is one race which was inferior and it evolved into another, there's no evidence. Rather, within that race, there was an inferior type and a superior type. Within this race, there was an inferior and superior type. But the races remained pretty much themselves. Those of an inferior organization and capacity perished. But it has not been shown that they left behind the human races of today as their descendants. So if you look at all the races of the world, even those where, it's not politically correct to say this, but there are races where the average IQ is lower, races where the average IQ is higher. And if you can show this 100 years ago, interestingly, after 100 years, the average IQ of the lower developed races has grown. And so what you find is a race stays within its own type even as it grows within its intelligence or other skills of capacity. Those of an inferior... Okay, so we skip that. But still, he says, such a development within the type is imaginable. Perhaps some perished, and so we have some kind of development. The progress of nature from matter to life, life to mind may be conceded. But there is no proof yet that matter developed into life, or life energy into mind energy. So he gives, I'm skipping now the lines, he says, we have still not seen how matter becomes living cell. You have matter, you have living cell, but you have nothing in between. There have been attempts to show, and so far they have failed. In the lab, you take material and somehow do something, and then you have a living cell. It used to be believed, and this is barely 150 years ago, that if you left matter as it was, eventually life would emerge out of it. What they did discover was that there was life of a minuscule kind, virus or bacteria, which had infected that matter, and it grew. And so it seemed as if life came out of dead matter. But well, it was always there, only you couldn't see it. And so Sri Aurobindo picks this point. There is no sufficient proof that any vegetable species developed into animal existence, or any organization of inanimate matter developed into living organism. Instead, he says that what you find is at each level there was a minuscule tiny bit of that consciousness organized, which developed, became progressively larger and more organized, but in consciousness terms it remained what it was. So we can say out of bacterium a more complex bacterium could emerge, but it still had to be there as a tiny seed bacteria from which it emerged. It was not dead matter out of which bacteria or living cell emerged. And he says, even if it's discovered that under certain chemical conditions life makes an appearance, still all that will be established by this coincidence is that in certain physical circumstances life manifests. But not that the chemicals are constituents of life. It's not that out of those chemicals life emerged. That would be evolution. It's rather you put together the chemicals and now life can come in. But the chemicals remained chemicals. Life process is separate, only using the chemicals. Here, as elsewhere, each grade of being exists in itself and by itself. Even in the chemicals, even in plant life, even in animal life. Is manifested according to its own character, by its own proper energy, and the gradation above or below it are not origins and resultant sequences, but only degrees in the continuous scale of earth nature. All we can say is earth nature has all these levels, but each level is and remains bound to its type. Now, at this point, you can see how compelling Sri Aurobindo's logic is, so much so that you will say, maybe that is so true. Maybe there is no such thing as evolution. Later, he will show you the linking point. What it will show us, though, is that although there is a linking point, the linking point is an exception. It's as if an urge, a push of the inhabiting consciousness is somehow able to break through life and make a leap, and then it falls back, and you have two separate types. But you do not have this continuous movement of something evolving, obviously. The evolution is driven by not the type, but by something else intervening inside the type and pushing it. If it be asked, how then did all these various gradations and types of being come into existence? It can be answered that fundamentally they are manifested in matter by the consciousness force in it, by the power of the real idea building its own significant forms and types for the indwelling spirit's cosmic existence. So the answer, how did these types come? Well, there is this push of the cosmic spirit, and it has its, we have developed the concept of real idea, that is a seed idea which holds the full possibility of that type, has the energy and knowledge to take up matter and mold it to create and express itself. The practical or physical method might vary considerably in different grades or stages, although a basic similarity of line may be visible. The creative power might use not one but many processes or set many processes to act together. So here's the mechanism of evolution, Sri Aurobindo says. It's not that there's just one fixed way to do it. The creative power says, all right, let me do it. And then it takes what is available and uses it. And if nothing is available, it can imprint a new capacity, a new power to shape it. Now this includes even the possibility, which is not explicitly stated here, even the possibility of materializing. That there are beings which are of a grade which are subtle, they become more and more densified in energy and consciousness and form until they acquire a gradation close enough to matter, where they would then be semi-solid beings until they fully solidify. Now, in fact, if you read the theosophical literature, this is how they describe the appearance of human beings on earth. While there was the ape, the human beings existed at the same time during a certain earlier cycle, but in a semi-materialized body. And then in the descending part of that cycle, they became more and more materialized and became the human species. That would make a lot of sense. It would explain how a completely radically new type can appear. There is even an example given today by modern science. In its genetic exploration, it comes to the conclusion that the octopus does not belong to conventional earthly evolution. There's nothing in other evolutionary types which would explain the emergence of the octopus, and it is even suggested by this that the octopus may represent a different line of evolution from another planetary system which got seeded on Earth. But this is the evidence of it, because it is so different in its working and composition. But well, you need not go to another planet. All you need to do is go up a few degrees of consciousness into the vital and mental worlds, where all these and much more rich and complex species exist. One of them, incidentally, is the unicorn. You have pictures of unicorns you have seen in fairy tales, textbooks for children. Interestingly, we only give it to children, we don't give it to adults. But all those stories which involve the unicorn declare them as a very rare animal with amazing powers. It had already become rare by that time. Maybe it was there more commonly and became rare, or it was never a physical creature. It always belonged to a subtle physical domain and could materialize partially under certain circumstances, and therefore its mythical character or its magical powers also. That it could give things, it had a power to do things which otherwise physical beings could not do. And visible more to the pure of heart or pure of mind, who could perceive beyond the veil of physical matter. So not everyone could see it, not everyone could enter in relation with it. It may not be comfortable with everybody if they were not pure enough. And therefore the difficulty in finding it or building a relationship of trust with it. Now if you look at this possibility, suddenly the mechanism of evolution becomes so much simpler. Because as you go higher up in the scales of consciousness, your mind can shape matter. Energy, life force can shape matter. In the vital world, your body has a certain elasticity. The vital body, it's finally energy flows only. And so it can expand, it can stretch to reach out. Physical sense of space has practically no relevance. It can become as elastic as it wants, as intense as it wants, or diminish in intensity, just like that by willing it. That's the nature of that elasticity. It can also densify itself in vibration, become more and more dull, losing its elasticity and plasticity until it becomes semi-materialized, close to the physical domain. But let's go up a step above the vital, into the mental world. Everything there is made of idea, conception of idea. So you can conceive of the unicorn, visualize and create the unicorn just like that by the power of your creative mind. Thought form emerges. And then from that thought form, which you fill into it energy, you densify it until it acquires a character which is vital mental. Energy imprint with a thought form, and then densify it further all the way down to the material. And you can literally create a new species of creature. But that would not be enough. The mind is not powerful enough. It's capable perhaps of materializing, but not sustaining. For that you have to go one more step into the real idea, which Sri Aurobindo has discussed before. This is the supramental creative power. In this creation, it's not just a mind creating a form. It is, in its very power of conception, consciousness taking form, substance, energy, but also knowing within its form how it must be, how it must respond to its circumstances. When it faces this kind of challenge, what is its relationship with it? When it faces that situation, what is its relationship and response? All that is held simultaneously in a flexible, not rigid awareness. And therefore idea, but a real idea, not just a conception of mind, but a real, substantial, self-existent power. And this is how the universe was born. A real idea became universe, but real idea can also become species of forms. So let's say, before the horse first appeared on earth, the real idea of horse existed, took form and organized itself in the domain of mind or the vital world, depending, it could go straight to the vital or subtle physical worlds. And then from there, by the delight of the consciousness force saying, densify. It's more fun to densify. It acquired a character which was dense enough to become physical horse. And given enough time, you would find the species thus becoming more and more tangible. Even today, we have some examples of beings like the mythical unicorn. You have the mythical abominable snowman, Yeti, or the Bigfoot in the Northern American regions. But equivalents of this kind are still seen and described by a few people, but never photographed. They leave footprints, but they've never been captured. They can somehow not be found. Perhaps they are on the borderline of the subtle physical, moving in and out. And so when they are more in the physical, they may leave footprints. Once they drift into the subtle physical, they are again invisible. So it might be happening that even now some species are being projected, and after a while they are there. It has always fascinated me that there's a particular fish called the Coelacanth, spelled C-O-E-L. Coelacanth, whose bones were found in the same strata as the extinct dinosaurs. But it had something peculiar. It had fins which had bones in them, which suggested the formation of possibly feet or hands. Until then, there was no transition seen between fish and land animal. And you're looking for it, just as you're looking for a transition from ape to human, no evidence. You must have some bone evidence if that transition took place. And there must be a rich enough evidence because there's such a rich variety of fish as well as animal types with 4 legs. They found none until this fish was found. I said, here is the evidence. It has this bone structure which must be hands and feet, because we have only partial bone structures, but we don't have the rest. So it must be. That's all we had. But that would have explained evolutionary transition and proved even this evolution. And then suddenly, mysteriously, within a few decades of this declaration, we find living coelacanths in the ocean. How amazing is that? The one thing which humanity said, here's the evidence, nature said, here I will throw you one living species of the fish. They found it off the coast of Africa. And in the living example, you could see they were not hands, they were not fish, they were not feet, they were regular fins. And suddenly the theory was blown. We still don't have the link. So then they said, where did the coelacanth come from? And so pursuing it, they discovered a very small number used to be caught occasionally off the coast of Madagascar or somewhere in that region. And it was mating in the region of Andaman Islands and would go back deep undersea. Now what is the likelihood that the very one species you find which bridges interspecies gap, was extinct 60 million years ago, is suddenly discovered to be alive in the ocean to prove or disprove your theory? It's almost as if somewhere nature said, well, it's not so easy. And she brings it up to us. So to me it makes the suggestion, perhaps, that nature has the power to materialize the species as necessary. And it doesn't need us. She's well able to do it by herself, and she can do that occasionally. We also find strange new species appearing as if out of nowhere in many of the rainforests. Where people have gone exploring a few decades, they say now we have mapped all the species of plants and birds and other animals. And then someone goes recently and says, we just discovered a whole new species which was never discovered before. Was it so easily ignored earlier, or did it appear in between? We don't really know. So it could be, as we are experiencing an extinction cycle, there's also the reappearance of new species taking place subtly in these remote regions, and perhaps nature will seed in a more direct way. Perhaps we'll use human intervention. We don't know the method. But once you recognize that there can be the mechanism of materialization, go up there into the vital worlds and mental worlds, such a rich diversity of species and creatures, and even the possibility to create new ones, and new ones being projected all the way down. But still, the point which he makes is they stay within their type. How did they appear? Real idea building its significant forms. The practical or physical method might vary considerably in different grades or stages. The creative power might use not one but many processes or set many forces to act together to make that possible. And he doesn't say which ones or how. That's the idea is it's not bound to one mechanism. I'm going to touch upon another example of this materialization process, which is actively happening right now, not in large organized species, but at the minuscule level of single-celled creatures of bacteria. Now, this is something which is, Mother speaks of this. She says when people die, the physical body is discarded, but the subtle physical gradation and even the vital layer, which is very close to the physical, that may hang around for a while. And if it has strong imprints of desire, those imprints tend to take form and become the energetic basis for the materialization of bacteria. So she says they form and they become bacteria by the energy loops that they put out, the desires. Now, this statement is made in somewhere in the 50s. If you think about the implications of this, let's for the moment just say she is right, whether science agrees or not. The implications of this are extraordinary. It means new bacteria will keep appearing all the time, or at least new variations of bacteria types will keep appearing all the time, just from this process, from new patterns of energy that people shed. Now here's the interesting thing. Increasingly in modern exploration we discover each individual has a unique pattern of bacteria in their gut. Now you're born from your mother's body, but your gut did not join with her gut at any point, right? And yet you find bacteria imprints within you which are similar to your mother's gut. But then there are unique bacteria which are within you which are not similar to your mother's gut and nowhere in your mother's body, but unique to your body. How did they appear? In fact, the gut bacteria pattern is so unique you can measure that and know which person it is. It's like gene typing. Now the only explanation for this, if you look at the mother's description, is our emotional states, our desire imprints of energies at a very dense material level are what become the gut bacteria. You don't have to die for that. That's what happens when your body dies and that part becomes the bacteria in the air, in the environment. But it's happening in you right now. In the energy imprints of your desires and strong emotions, they are forming this type, unique to you. But the bacteria are in a constant interface in your digestive process and in your physical health. In other words, now increasingly we recognize the bacteria influence not only the nutrition in your blood, they influence your thought processes and even your emotional states. By introducing a particular gut bacteria, you can make for the thought forms to shift. I'll give an example here. There's a gut bacteria which is unique to cats. It transfers from the cat through the environment into the mouse. If it infects the mouse successfully, then inside the mouse it changes mouse behavior and it finds itself no more afraid of the cat. It finds itself even attracted to the cat. You see how the mechanism. And then it goes, it's eaten up by the cat, gets back into the gut bacteria of the cat, and through the cat poop it gets back into the environment to reinfect the mouse and bring it back to the cat. If you think of the bacteria now as an energy imprint, it is an energy imprint coming from the cat's desire to reach out to mouse, physically entering the mouse, making the mouse desire the cat, pulling it to the cat, and then recycling. Now if you think of bacteria differently, purely as energy imprints, you see how sensible this is and how it can modify behavior. Otherwise, purely by genetic terms, you cannot explain how bacteria in your gut will change the thought process in the mouse, will change the species behavior and overcome the instinct of fear of cat. You can't explain it. unless it's an energetic change and not a genetic change. Okay? Now this has massive implications. It means our gut bacteria is a product of our desire imprints, which are then feeding back to your own thought forms, your emotional reactions. Today, increasingly, they are correlating gut bacteria with your body's tendency to put on fat or not put on fat, epileptic fits, thought formations, even psychiatric conditions have been tied to gut bacteria. You remove the gut bacteria and the psychiatric condition changes. This correlation is again unexplainable unless you recognize bacteria not primarily biological but as energy imprints. And the infection of an energy entering you, modifying your thought, or even troubling you from within as an energy bundle formation, a case of mild possession, we will say, by an energy bundle, rooting itself in the bacteria base of form. That is how you would be able to understand it more deeply. If you accept this, okay, one more point. Again, recent research shows all of us carry an environment of bacteria which is unique to our type. I spoke of guts, that's still inside the body. But around your body is an environment of bacteria which is also unique to you, measurable and as specific as gene typing. How does it get out from your skin to form an environment? Doesn't make sense. And you're moving all the time. Just now the fan spinning is blowing all the air away. And yet the environing bacteria is pretty much the same. How do you explain that? You cannot explain it unless you recognize bacteria is crystallization of my aura, energy, emotion, thought patterns. Now you recognize if bacteria are crystallization of your thoughts and emotions, what are the possibilities for this? Evolve out of it. So this idea of something materializing from a subtler grade is not so far out. It's happening right now within us, around us. And it goes both ways. Our thoughts, emotions materialize the bacteria types, and the bacteria type feed back to compel the same thought emotional patterns within us. So I've taken this as an example because otherwise in current research they just make this observation, they don't explain it. It's unexplainable. But when you look from this deeper angle, it's not only explainable, it makes eminent sense. If the cat and mouse can have this bacteria pulling it, what about human beings? We speak of pheromones, but that's only one small part of the energetic influences which go out there. You know what are pheromones? They are smells which the human body puts out, which change the behavior of people around you. Interestingly, by its very definition, a pheromone cannot be smelt. It's more like molecules which go out, and when they are breathed in, your brain, behavior, thought, emotion change. Suddenly you like the person or you don't like, you're attracted to the person or you're repelled. It changes your behavior energetically. And you can't explain this unless you recognize pheromone is nothing but the physical representation of energy, patterns of energy, which reach out constantly, interchange constantly, attract, repel, and have affinities or contraries of affinities. So what I am describing here, the reason I'm going into this is to show you there's already so much happening within and around us which involves physical representation of energy bundles. And there's this constant interchange taking place. So why not something more sophisticated? Why not the bacteria now grows to become more complex of that grade of consciousness of energy, thought, emotion, and grow eventually to become a type of its own more complex? Not a big stretch. Real idea, building its own significant forms. The physical methods vary. Creative power may use many processes. It doesn't need one process. In matter, the process is a creation of infinitesimals charged with an immense energy. Their association by design and number, the manifestation of larger infinitesimals on that primary basis. The grouping and association of these together to found the appearance of sensible objects, earth, water, minerals, metals, the whole material kingdom. Straight away, he's giving you the mechanism in matter. What happened? First, you had infinitesimals which were created, charged with immense energy. So, what's an electron? Infinitesimal. Created how? Well, it just came. We don't know how. Okay, you go down to subatomic particles, muons, which are unstable. But you have other kinds of leptons and all kinds of names. They give you a zoo of 300 particles, all unstable. But they start with huge energy in a tiny spot. Then they associate, join by design and number. An atomic structure is created. Protons, electrons insert in each other. Grouping of larger infinitesimals on that basis. And you see the enormous energy which is held in the atoms. Then the grouping and association of these to found appearance of sensible objects. When many atoms combine, you have molecules which create all the minerals, metals, earth, water, and the whole material kingdom. All molecules are basis for that. So what do you see here? Infinitesimal combining to form stable groups, then those groups combining to create this type. At the beginning, the infinitesimal has huge energy. By the time it has become the stable type, that energy is now as if hidden inside. So you can take a blade of grass and burn it. You will not have an atomic explosion. Interesting. You are only changing the superficial grouping. But if you went back all the way and broke the atom, you would have the atomic explosion and release. So what's the pattern he's teaching you here of mechanism of materialization? Okay, tiny bits with huge energy combining to create stable forms with less energy expressed, all energy bound and hidden. Then these stable forms with lower energy combining to create the larger macroscopic forms where you have practically no appearance of energy. It's content, stable, still. At best you burn, gives off a little bit of heat. That's it. Now this is at the mineral level. In life also, the consciousness force begins with infinitesimal forms of vegetable life and infinitesimal animalcules. Not molecules, animalcules. Sri Aurobindo is making a new word. But you see the idea. The seed of plant, not physical seed, the seed form which is representing plant, the plankton in the ocean would be one of those types. But you could go still smaller. They are still vegetal in nature, but single-celled vegetal forms. Similarly, of animal nature, there are single-celled animal forms, animalcules. It creates an original plasm that combines to create the more stable structure and multiplies it, creates the living cell as a unit, creates other kinds of minute biological apparatus, like the seed or the gene. Uses always the same method of grouping and association so as to build by a various operation various living organisms. So now if you go back to the original, it's the same structure as we saw with minerals. These tiny things which have the energy combining to create something more complex, which is the plasm, and then its combinations and variation of its combinations making for everything else. All plant structure you can reduce to certain common genetic structures, which you can reduce to certain common essential core elements, certain common essential cells or plasm structures. Same with higher forms of life. And then variety. But same method, different variation. A constant creation of types is visible, but that is no indubitable proof of evolution. You do not see evolution here. You only see different types formed by this. So I take the genetics of a rabbit, I make a major change in it, and I have a completely different creature. Maybe it has similarities to rabbit, but other than the similarities in its species and as a behavior, it's completely different. You have not seen evolution. You've just seen a restructuring of the arrangements. That's all. constant creation of types is visible, but that is no indubitable proof. The types are sometimes distant from each other, sometimes closely similar, sometimes identical in basis but different in detail. All are patterns, and such a variation in patterns with an identical rudimentary basis for all is the sign of a conscious force playing with its own idea and developing by it all kinds of possibilities of creation. This is the evidence of the deeper spiritual process behind. It's conscious force playing with its own idea and just making variations on top of that. When the human being now takes the genes and modifies it, it's still conscious force using a different mechanism to make the same change. Animal species, in coming into birth, may begin with a like rudimentary, embryonic or fundamental pattern for all. It may follow out up to a stage certain similarities of development on some or all of its lines. There may too be species that are twi-natured, amphibious, intermediate between one type and another. But all this need not mean that the types developed one from the other in an evolutionary series. Now, he's straight away breaking at the very roots of the whole scientific paradigm of evolution, but with evidence which is so strong you cannot question it. What you see, for example, in the human embryo, from the fetus, when it starts growing, it goes through a stage when it looks like a tadpole, then it looks like a fish, then it looks like a four-legged animal, and then it appears more and more like an ape. Even the face looks like an ape, and then suddenly it changes further and becomes human. At any of these transition points, it could have stopped and taken on a different direction. It's almost as if in the embryo, the nature is showing you all that it could have been doing, all it has done, or all the stages we have been through perhaps, but taking them through quickly, it stops at this point. Why doesn't it go further? Why is it that in the embryo of the ape, it goes up to the ape, same as the human, but it stops at the ape and stays at ape? Why is it in the four-legged animal, it goes through all those stages which are same as the human, but it stops at the four-legged stage and becomes that? And you have no rational answer. That's how it is. Who does that? The force, consciousness force, saying, well, this is where I want to go. This is the form I want to play in. And that's it. So, fundamental principle is common to all of them. The forms it develops are different, and variations and so on. Sometimes in the evolutionary tree, they take very different lines of development and come back to appearing very similar. The eye, appearance of the human eye, has taken at least 6 different streams of development, ending up with something similar across all the species. Interesting. But that just shows you the free play possible. Then he speaks of forces which can change the characteristics, which can make the form itself become different. And he is going to tell you things which we don't know. Food is one. Light rays. Science does not yet know how important light rays are. And so we will explore all these. It's a long paragraph where he describes all the mechanisms for the change, but which stay always within that same typal variation. So let's step back at what he has shown us. Because next paragraph will be, man is a type among many types so constructed, one pattern among the multitude of patterns. He is the most complex that has been created, richest in content of consciousness and the curious ingenuousness of his building, the head of earthly creature. But he does not exceed it. This is the type that has formed it. The supramental being, will it be the product of this process or a different process? This is the point he will get to. Why is this discussion so important? By understanding the fundamentals of evolution or the creation of types, let's say, we will be able to recognize the means by which the new type of humanity has to emerge and what will be its relationship to the current human type. And we will also see the mechanism for transition of consciousness between types. And all that will become clear further on. But now what we are seeing is the foundation for understanding life and the method of creation and appearance of forms. Always it starts with a seed with a huge power energized, which then combines to create a core pattern. Then that pattern combining with itself in many variations creates for all the different physical appearances of types. This is true not only at the level of metals, it is true at the level of plants, it is true at the level of conscious life forms. Within that, the complexity makes for specific projections of consciousness or even a higher grade of expression of consciousness. But that's about all. What are the things which make for these variations and methods used? We will see a little later. And then the mechanism of natural selection or some subconscious impulse or even some higher consciousness working behind the scenes, all of these he will describe, which make for all these variations of psychological content. So when you look at the earth across a span of a few thousand years, at a time when you could not have people moving around easily between cultures and nations, each culture developed a special imprint of psychological interest or type or creativity, and with it a biological variation. And what made for that choice, what made for those variations, all that machinery he will describe in the rest of this paragraph, which we will take up next Sunday. So here we have a very deep understanding of what's happening. With it, the insight into how far this can go. And with that, perhaps the key to what is necessary for the next step. And still the question is left open, is there evolution or not? Because all this still exists and you can have a full rich play of all levels of consciousness. But what is evolution? What makes evolution itself move like this and change from one type to another? And this will go to the heart where, having understood this, you can look anywhere in the universe, any planet, any galaxy, and you will be able to understand the evolutionary principles working there, because this is universal, across space, across time. And this is one of the special features of Sri Aurobindo's writings. He never stops with a superficial appearance. He goes all the way to the foundations of things and builds the whole understanding of a reality from that foundation. And inevitably that foundation is spiritual. It is the consciousness and the power of consciousness working. But what are the secrets of that power of consciousness? How does she work? He reveals to us. So when you go into that domain, it becomes what we call occult science. Because there it is the working of consciousness and energy. But then on the surface, it becomes physical science. And he bridges the two actually. When we understand this, having understood this, you can actually intervene on the physical level, as science is already doing. But you could go deeper and intervene at that life principle level, and you will have an occult mechanism for intervention. Or you could go all the way to the core, which is spiritual, the consciousness force, and you'll have a spiritual power of intervention. And if we are to make that radical leap of consciousness that the supramental consciousness represents, it will have to be from that foundation outward. Whether it will use this mechanism or not is a question to be seen. But once you have the core, it does not matter what machinery you use, because you can use any kind of means to actualize what the core is able to do. So this is to understand why this chapter is so important. We can meditate on this for a few minutes and we'll continue next Sunday.